Not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Labour's net zero plans have been costed by the right-wing think tank Policy Exchange, and its plans to decarbonise the grid by 2030 could cost you a whopping £116 billion. And this is why they want to move you onto smart meters, to make you pay more. New damning revelations about the Clapham chemical attacker and asylum seeker Abdul Ezedi have come to light. The supposed Christian convert needed a chaperone in church as he wasn't deemed to be safe enough to be left alone following his conviction for sexual assault. So why did the church vouch for his asylum application? The outdated funding model of the public service broadcaster, the EU-loving BBC, is set to consider a wealth tax to pay for its increasingly biased programming. But when will the BBC get to grips with the free market and face the consequences of its decisions? I will be breaking my silence on the Garrick Club membership row as 4 more old women resign from the men-only members club. But if you're concerned about this tradition of men-only membership, worry not, for left-wing activist, formerly of the BBC, John Sopel, has joined to work for change from the inside. Plus, a farmer who was part of yesterday's demonstrations has driven all the way to Westminster in his 7-ton tractor to discuss the benefits of our farming industry. State of the Nation starts now. Also be joined by my most theatrical panel, barrister and former Conservative MP Jerry Hayes and the author and journalist Michael Crick. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's your favourite part of the day, the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. First, let's update you on the developments from the United States and Baltimore in particular, where President Biden has pledged full federal support to the city in the bridge rescue operation there. Video footage captured the moment a freight ship stacked high with containers crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge at around 1:30 this morning local time. That collision plunging cars and their drivers and construction workers into the water below with no warning at all. We now know that the vessel involved in today's crash was reported to have a structural issue in 2016 and was also involved in a separate accident when it hit a port wall in Belgium. Let's show you the scene live in Baltimore right now, where 6 construction workers remain unaccounted for. The governor of Maryland has been speaking to reporters in the last half hour. He says it's still very much an active search and rescue mission.
There is not a single resource that we will hold off on deploying. I have already authorized the deployment of everything from air, land, and sea resources to make sure that this search and rescue operation is carried out to its fullest intent.
Where's more? Now, news here at home. A mini reshuffle has taken place in Downing Street today, following the departure from government of James Heappey and Robert Halfon. We've heard tonight that Nasrani becomes Minister for Europe. Leo Doherty is Minister for the Armed Forces. Kevin Hollinrake moves to be Minister for Business and Trade. Luke Hall takes Education. And Alan Mack becomes Under-Secretary of State in Business and Trade and the Cabinet Office. Now, the chemical attack suspect Abdul Ezedi was granted asylum in the UK by a judge despite concerns the sex offender was a liar with a criminal past. A range of previously confidential documents have shown today for the first time the lengths that Ezedi went to prove he was a Christian convert. His body was pulled from the River Thames last month amid a major manhunt after he was suspected of dousing his ex-girlfriend with a corrosive chemical. Britain and the United States have accused China of carrying out a global campaign of malicious cyber attacks. It's an unprecedented move, with Britain publicly blaming China for targeting the Electoral Commission yesterday and the email accounts of peers and MPs. British intelligence services believe that Chinese spies are likely to use hacked information to target critics of Xi Jinping's government. The United States charged 7 of the alleged hackers yesterday. And finally, a former British Museum curator has been ordered by the High Court to return stolen artefacts within 4 weeks. Dr. Peter Higgs, who was dismissed for misconduct, faces allegations of theft and damage to over 1,800 historical items, accusations he denies. The courts also ordered Mr. Higgs to disclose records from his eBay and PayPal accounts, following claims he listed hundreds of the stolen items for sale online. That's the news. For the latest stories, do sign up to GB News Alerts. Scan the QR code on the screen right now or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
As we've discussed in recent weeks, the matter of grid decarbonisation is becoming of increasing political importance as the two main political parties take different positions on the matter. Under the Labour Party's plans, it proposes entirely to decarbonise the grid by 2030, in just 6 years' time. In practice, this means drastically reducing our reliance on gas power and other sources of non-renewable energy. But how this is achievable is unclear, because the grid currently operates with gas power stations used as a backup when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun isn't shining. If the grid were to be decarbonised by 2030, what will we do in these frequent instances when the sun and wind cannot be relied upon? The Conservative plan isn't much better, as it proposes decarbonisation by 2035. Although this gives a little more time for the development of carbon capture and energy storage technology, the questions for the Labour's plan apply very much to the Conservative plan too. That's why I believe we should abandon the policy and indefinitely postpone net zero. But Policy Exchange's new report has cast even more doubt on the overall structure. The report has estimated that the Conservative plan for 2035 would cost about £105 billion, which is clearly unaffordable while the cost of living is high, as well as the tax burden at almost record levels. But more importantly, the Labour plan is estimated to cost an additional £116 billion of your money over the next 11 years, about £15 billion a year more. And what is even more damning than this is that the report has said that even if Labour could acquire the additional funds, which would be from you by taxing you even more, the project is unfeasible owing to supply chain constraints, lead times and skills shortages. So, when the shadow climate change secretary and famous bacon sandwich eater Ed Miliband doubled down on the plan earlier this month, he was ignoring reality. This news has coincided with the fact that Ofcom has announced plans to remove the current electricity price cap system and replace it with a variable cap. Ofgem, of course, not Ofcom. In other words, everything you've been told about smart meters is not true, even when they work, which apparently 4 million of them do not. While you were led to believe that they were there to help you manage your money, in reality they are being introduced to implement a surge pricing system to cost you more. So instead of the grid doing what it ought to do, providing greater supply when demand increases, instead it will push prices up to reduce demand. And why will it do this? Because when the grid is decarbonised, we will not be able to meet peak demand because we'll be relying on solar and wind, which are unreliable. UK's energy infrastructure is being engulfed by the net zero utopia, but the role of the government is to make people's lives easier and more affordable. And only when we break free from this fantasy world will we be able to provide cheap energy, as the United States, India and China do. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. Well, I'm very pleased now to be joined by Bob Ward, Policy and Communications Director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Thank you very much for coming in.
Hello.
These plans just aren't realistic, are they? There isn't £116 billion around at the moment. And if there were, we should be spending it on defence when we've got a threat from Russia and China and Iran.
Well, these numbers are investments, mostly paid for by the private sector, that will generate jobs and growth. And we have a great problem with a lack of investment in this country. But let's remember why we're doing it. These investments will reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are costing us huge amounts. The energy price guarantee and the other policies that you introduced as Energy Minister to protect consumers rightly against the surging price in natural gas cost the British taxpayer £78 billion. £78 billion of British taxpayer subsidy that went directly into the pockets of energy companies. You clawed half back through the windfall tax.
But that was a self-inflicted cost because we haven't had fracking to get cheap gas out of the ground in the UK. We decided that we would have this mad environmentalist policy that means we weren't maximising our fossil fuel resources, and we therefore allowed ourselves to become dependent on Russia. That was entirely predictable series of policy mistakes made because of the green obsession.
Well, maximising the oil and gas from the North Sea is actually in law, so it is part of government policy.
Which is now, but not fracking. Fracking is a great opportunity, and we get fracked gas from the United States instead of doing it ourselves, which would be much cheaper and more environmentally friendly.
I mean, you know, fracking around the country, people have made their views known. But the important thing is that any oil and gas that we produce in the UK, either in the North Sea or on land, is sold on international markets. The oil and gas that we were buying during the cost of living crisis included British gas.
But as you know,
it doesn't reduce our bills.
Of course it does. Because pricing is set at the margin. So if supply is increased, even when demand increases, that supply means that the overall price is lower. That's just the basics of supply and demand.
No, I'm sorry, Jacob, you misunderstand. The impact of the war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, drastically reduced the amount of gas. There's nowhere near enough gas in the UK to restore those levels of supply.
International
it's just
prices
not true.
are set by total supply and total demand. If we increase our supply, that has effect on international prices. Therefore, the price is lower for everybody.
We have a minuscule amount of gas. It makes no difference.
Of course it makes a difference. This is a simple misunderstanding.
It just isn't.
A simple misunderstanding of economics, particularly with gas, which either has to be transported or burnt off.
So why didn't we reduce the price of gas during the cost of living crisis, Jacob?
The price of gas came down, the supply came on.
No, it didn't.
Online.
The price went up. You had to protect consumers by spending £78 billion
extra supply came on. Extra supply came on from Texas. It came on from Qatar. Increased supply saw the price come down.
Yeah, but they have lots of gas, Jacob. We don't have anywhere near that amount of gas.
We do if we fracked it.
No, we really don't.
But the fundamental point you're missing, and all the people who've made this argument are missing, is that all pricing is set at the margin. So if you
understand how it works, Jacob.
If you have a cubic foot extra of gas, the price comes down. If you have a cubic foot too little, the price goes up. Therefore, marginal supply is crucially important to any pricing mechanism.
It is. However, if you reduce supply by 38 billion tonnes and you replace it with 300 million tonnes, you do not restore the level of pricing.
Yes, but if we had been fracking, we would have had a much higher base to start with.
We really don't have that much.
And
if you could persuade your constituents that you're happy to have them have it fracked in their back garden,
they would
it won't make any
them
difference.
For it.
There's no economist who will tell you that we have enough to reduce the global price of gas.
It has made an enormous difference in the United States, where their fracking has both reduced their emissions and reduced their cost of energy.
Okay, tell me how much you think the global price of gas has been reduced by British gas over the past 2 years. At a time when we've had to subsidise British consumers have been subsidised by £78 billion.
And market forces have worked because places like the US and Qatar have brought on masses of new supply.
We are still...
So prices have come down.
Indeed. The point is, you increase supply by big producers. We're not a big producer.
Where are we getting this £116 billion
OK, so let's talk about investment. So remember, this is an investment...
Investment is a new Labour word for spending. This is money that will be spent.
Investment is something that
what return will people get? It's a dishonest word. It's a dishonest word. Because investment is when you put money in the bank and get interest on it. It's not when you spend money you don't get back.
Let me give you an example of an investment. Investment could be something like spending money on replacing gas boilers with heat pumps to heat.
Hold on, let me explain.
It's an investment because the return is you do not then pay eye-watering prices for natural gas.
Natural gas prices come right down.
That's an investment because you
not.
save
You're
money.
spending £13,000. You're spending £13,000 rather than £3,000.
You're saving. You save the British taxpayer £78 billion that you spend on price guarantees.
I wouldn't appoint you as my investment manager because I'd get bankrupt within weeks. If you think spending £10,000 extra is an investment...
Jacob, you spent the £78 billion that went into the pocket of energy producers.
That was because we had this absurd obsession with green energy when we've got plenty...
It wasn't. It went to the oil and gas companies, Jacob.
If we hadn't closed down our coal-powered electricity stations, we would have had that resource for energy, we would have had our own gas resources from fracking, and it's the green obsession that has put prices up.
So you want to go back to the 1950s when we were...
my constituents...
want coal. I'm pretty sure your constituents don't want climate change and they don't want air pollution.
I don't want them to be cold and poor, and we make no difference. 1% of global emissions.
That's how much you spend.
Thank you very much, Bob, because we've got to end. Coming up, defining proof has emerged that the BBC is a socialist operation. It wants to bring in a wealth tax. Plus, don't forget, a farmer has driven to Westminster in his 7-ton tractor to discuss the difficulties faced by farmers.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
New framework from the Department of Transport is making sure that people will have a say on whether LTNs are introduced. So councils are going to have to really find out whether residents in an area actually want them or not. Let's talk to former racing driver and motoring journalist Amanda Stretton. Amanda, good to see you. I'm surprised that councils were introducing them without any sort of consultation already, to be honest.
I know, it's an absolute mystery, isn't it? Because certainly in the area that I live, the which is in Oxford, the implementation of the low traffic neighbourhoods has been, I mean, the report that we've seen today talks about the challenge that emergency services are having getting to people who actually need them. It's also impacting all the local businesses because people are being forced onto these main arterial routes. Those routes are now absolute gridlock. And what's been happening are these low traffic neighbourhoods have been decided by people who don't live in the area. They don't understand the way traffic moves, the times of day. And it has therefore just led to absolute chaos. So it makes perfect sense that if these schemes are going to be introduced, they're actually introduced with the support of the people who it's going to affect.
Well, and that's going to be problematic, don't you think? Because once everybody has talked it, discussed it, most residents are not going to want it.
I think you've got to understand, you know, if the vast majority of people are rejecting the proposal of a scheme that's due to be implemented, you've really got to question the viability and the sense in doing so. We want to encourage people to cycle, absolutely, but actually by causing these huge congested blocks, these arteries, I really don't think that that's necessarily the way forward.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, we've been discussing net zero fantasies, and your male mogs have been getting rid of hot air and coming through with good sense. Colin says, don't forget, Labour's net zero plans are forecast to cost £190 billion, just like HS2 was forecast to cost a sum that's now multiplied exponentially. Net zero is for the birds and is not a priority for the British people. Mike The ambition to achieve decarbonisation is all very well, but the timescale is unrealistic. And David, Jacob, why have we got to be carbon neutral? What's the point when China and India are still building more coal-powered power stations? So a few weeks ago, we discussed the instance of false Christian conversions of asylum seekers. One of the key examples of this was the case of Abdul Ezedi, the Clapham chemical attacker who had a history of sexual offences. Well now, revelations from court documents this afternoon show that Ezedi had been forced to be effectively escorted in and out of church services because he was deemed unsafe in light of his sexual assault conviction. And it was 8 months after this conviction that a reverend at the church signed a letter vouching for his conversion. It was submitted to his asylum hearing and it read, "I hope that this information will be of assistance and I would support his application to remain in this country." It appears this reverend has much to answer for. If Ezedi was deemed so unsafe that he couldn't be left alone in church, what made the reverend think he was safe enough to be granted asylum? Well, with me now is my distinguished panel and theatrical panel, Jerry Hayes and Michael Crick. Michael, this is a very odd story, isn't it, that the judge had this evidence before him and believed that in spite of his criminal convictions, he was probably telling the truth. It's pretty naive, isn't it?
I think it reflects very badly on the judge and the reverend that vouched for him. I mean, I don't see any way of defending them, frankly, and so I'm not going to. I mean, this man was a menace to society, as we've seen many times over, and there was an element of gullibility by both the church and the judicial system, and I think the people involved should be deeply ashamed of themselves and deeply worried as to why they were so gullible, and indeed should be asking themselves, are they fit to carry on in the offices they now hold?
Do you think it shows deeper problems within the immigration service, or that this is something that happens very rarely and that we get a disproportionate focus on errors when they have tragic consequences?
Well, there is clearly a problem with people coming to this country and seeking asylum and who are maybe thinking, may have come from countries where Christians are persecuted, and therefore maybe, I think just given the numbers of conversions, you know, there are people exploiting the system and there's no conversion at all.
Jerry, do you worry when you get cases like this, there's always the temptation to go off in the other direction? It's very hard to defend what's happened here. But will this lead to people who have genuinely converted and genuinely face persecution if they go back being in more difficulties?
It's up to the judges. I don't know too much about this case, what I've read in the papers, and I always think it's unwise to comment on that sort of thing. But I can tell you as a generality, I have prosecuted a whole load of scams, whereas various vicars from various churches have been making money out of this.
And this isn't new in its way, is it? Because
no,
if you go back 20 years, there were vicars who were involved in false marriages and so on.
Exactly.
And that whenever there is a system, there will people who will seek to get round it.
Absolutely.
And that's where we hope we can rely on the judges, which is why it seems so much of a failure that the judge knew this man was a sex offender and then goes on to say, but I believe his conversion is genuine.
I just find it extraordinary, actually. I haven't read the papers. I've read the newspapers and I've listened to what was said here, so I don't know exactly what's happened, but I do find
But you're a criminal barrister, so you see people in this world.
Yes.
And what reaction would you have had in these circumstances with your experience of the criminal law?
I would have been surprised and just think, why did the judge make that decision? And we don't know why he made that decision because we haven't got the full details. I don't think it's a breakdown of the criminal law. It may be a breakdown in the clergy, not this particular clergyman, but I've prosecuted so many cases where people have actually been illegally bringing people into the country and doing these ceremonies for money.
For money.
That is wrong.
Yeah.
That is wrong. I mean, I don't know, Jerry, but would the judge in this case have been a criminal barrister by background or a civil barrister by background? Because he would have been an immigration guy.
Right.
I mean,
but you would have thought that
after a while, immigration people would get to know the system and how it's worked. But I suppose the other concern is that somebody gets deported back to their home country, and something terrible happens to them.
Yeah. I mean, it is difficult. But let's go on to the EU-loving BBC, because its Director General, Tim Davie, earlier today signalled the intent of the public service broadcaster to consider what is effectively a wealth tax for the television tax. The tax itself is set to increase by £10.50 from Monday to £169.50 after a 2-year freeze. However, Mr Davie addressed a group of broadcasting chiefs today in which he said that funding reform is necessary. And while he's right that reform is necessary, implementing a so-called progressive system of the television tax is really showing how out of touch the corporation is. We've moved well past the days of forcing people to pay for it compulsorily. Its time feels the wrath of the free market and gets in line with other subscription and ad-based services. Well, back to my panel. Jerry, the licence fee, the television tax, has passed its sell-by date, surely.
Pause there. Your dad was an excellent chairman of the government of the BBCs because he believed in quality. No, I know, no.
In the 1980s?
Yeah, in the 1980s.
It's very different.
There is still impartiality. There is still quality. However, things are moving on. I'm not part of this movement who believe they're terribly biased one way or the other. I don't think they are. I think they do their best. Sometimes they get it horribly wrong. But there are different platforms, there are different people who look at their media in different ways. So I think in 5 years' time, the BBC licence fee is going to be redundant.
Michael, I'm actually more sympathetic to the BBC than...
Because of your dad. He was vice chairman, wasn't he?
He was vice chairman, but he was actually acting chairman for extended periods for various reasons, but we don't need to go into that. The problem for the BBC is that the television tax licence fee has harmed it, that its revenue has been, in real terms, pretty static for 20, 30 years, whereas other people, Sky, Netflix, which didn't even exist, have been able to grow their revenue into the trillions and become bigger than the BBC. And that if the BBC had freedom to raise revenue, it could be a world-beating organisation run sinking into becoming a small national player.
It could, but there's an element of risk in investments like that. And we would be criticising... I mean, if the BBC had invested in all sorts of dramas that turned out to be flops, we would no doubt be discussing that. So that is one problem. And I agree with Jerry that in the long term, the licence fee won't survive. But I think that this is actually a very good proposal in the interim, while we sort out what the future funding method is, 5 or 10 years. And it is unfair that middle-class people, wealthy people, and wealthy people, some of whom are middle-class, are paying... the BBC is probably watched by them more than it's watched by poor working class people. But
£100,000 doesn't take us... But then it's a difficult one.
Well, first of all, should the BBC know people's income, which I think would be ridiculous? And secondly, we can watch ITV for free. And thirdly, we can watch Sky for a subscription. That there's absolutely no reason to say that it should be done on a tax basis. I hardly ever watch the BBC.
Well, I think you probably watch it or listen to it more often than you might think.
I listen a bit to Radio 4. I very rarely watch the BBC.
Well, the BBC still has very good listening and viewing figures.
Yeah, it does, but they're declining.
And an amazing range of output. And actually, the licence fee of 160, what is it?
69
is extremely good value if you compare it, say, with what people are prepared to pay for, you know, football on Sky or other channels that show football, or Netflix, or Now channel, or whatever.
Netflix, I pay $5.99 a month.
Yes, but you're only getting films for that, or you're only getting entertainment. You're not getting the news for that. You're not getting
news
sport
for free on GBNews. It's much better.
Oh, do you? I thought you weren't a news channel.
We get Polly Middlehurst reading the news. I get my news from Polly.
But no, it is good value, and I support broadly the BBC. It's got, you know, it can be wasteful from time to time. And in the long term, the licence fee won't survive. But this is a fairer system. I suppose one way of doing it is saying anybody who pays... you know, the higher rate of tax, for instance, has to pay a higher rate of licence. I mean, there is already a means test in that people, Jerry isn't quite in this category, over the age of 75, they get it for free.
It's absolutely monstrous. It's like saying you should pay more for a pint of milk because you've got an income above X. This is rank socialism of the worst
You
kind.
just described it as a tax, so therefore you should think it's fair. I mean, actually, this is a model in a way for what, one way, the next Labour government might raise a bit more more money.
Compulsory tax for a service.
From the council tax with extra VAT.
So, Jacob, what are you saying?
Yeah.
Are you saying we shouldn't have...
I'm saying the BBC should go for adverts, subscription, product placement, the works.
Yes.
And
so, in other words, chasing audiences.
Of course, it's not what it does anyway.
But surely
the
GBNews
iPlayer is a brilliant service and people should pay for it.
Why?
Well, because otherwise...
you talk about Netflix, but Netflix, I mean, gosh, what do we pay? £60 a month, something like that?
I don't. I pay $5.99 for Netflix.
$5.99?
Yeah, I have the minimum basic
subscription. This man should be prosecuted.
Anyway,
I think it's $6.99 now, isn't it? But anyway,
I think it's $5.99. Thank you to my panel. Coming up, I will finally be breaking my silence on the question of the Garrick Club and its men-only membership as 4 old women resign as members. Plus, a farmer has driven to Westminster in his tractor to debate the pros and cons of free trade with me. I can only hope he doesn't take me for a ride. Boom, boom.
Hi there, time to look at the Met Office forecast for GB News. Rain and hill snow across northern parts of the UK during the next 24 hours. Showers moving in elsewhere, although interspersed by at least some brighter interludes. Low pressure still well and truly in charge. That low mainly sitting towards the southwest of the UK, and it is sending a band of rain north during the evening into Northern Ireland, where some wet weather could cause issues, rain warning in force, as well as central and northern England, parts of Wales, and then eventually that rain moves into Scotland, where it mixes with cold air to give some snow above 200 or 300 metres. The far north stays dry but chilly. And further south, some clear spells, although the next area of rain moves in by dawn to affect southwest England, Wales, Northern Ireland as well. Heavy downpours, gusty winds, and then that rain, well, it tends to turn to showers as it moves into central UK by the afternoon. Further showers arrive later from the southwest with gusty winds, hail and thunder. A lively afternoon, although with some pretty clouds in the sky. Now, in the far north, we're going to see wet and windy weather remain until Thursday morning, and then Thursday starts off bright across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Elsewhere, for England and Wales, a blustery start with further heavy rain to come, followed by showers, and those showers developing fairly widely as we go into the Easter weekend. I suspect Good Friday, Saturday and Easter Day. Mostly, we're going to see sunny spells and showers before more prolonged rain on Monday.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debate, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Well, you've been firing in your mailbogs. We've been discussing Abdul Ezedi and the BBC. On the BBC, Brian says, when will the BBC be made responsible for its decisions? Well, Jacob, that's down to you and your colleagues. And on Ezedi, Alison says, will the lady that this horrific person attacked have any recourse against the church, as it was the church who authenticated him? And that is small c for church, because I'm not entirely sure which church it is. It's not Holy Mother and it's not the Anglican Church. Now, it's time to break my silence on the Garrick Club affair. As you may have guessed, I am, in fact, a member of the Garrick Club, which has been in the news recently, mainly for the fact that its membership list has been exposed, with many being criticised for their membership of a men's-only club. But some news from this morning seems to refute this. Seems, at least according to the picture, that 4 old women have resigned from the club. Possibly under pressure from the Lord Chief Justice, Lady Sue Carr, who has shown the lefty tendencies of Baroness Hale, formerly President of the Supreme Court, by raising the dread words of diversity and inclusion in relation to Garrick Club membership, a surprisingly political intervention from a senior judge. Anyway, joking apart for a moment, the whole debacle has posed a serious societal question about whether such spaces should exist at all. Personally, I think they should. I enjoy being a member of the Garrick, but some, like the left-wing activist John Sopel, formerly of the BBC, have taken the brave and bold decision to join the club and work to reform it from the inside. I'm joined now by my panel, barrister and Garrick Club member, Jerry Hayes. You can tell from the tie that he's wearing. He's regularly in the Garrick, probably more often in the courtroom. And the author and journalist...
wicked!
The author and journalist, Michael Crick. Michael, it seems to me that the clubs people belong to isn't a really important matter, that if they like the society of the club, that's up to them.
But if you take the case of the what you described as the 4 old women, and by the way, you're going to be in trouble on 2 fronts from that, from the feminist movement and from the legal authorities, I hope. The judges are required to show independence, not to show bias or favour when it comes to important issues like this. And the United States, for instance, cracked down on senior figures belonging to clubs that excluded black people many years ago. And I think that it's quite right that those judges should resign.
But it's quite political in that case, in which case should the Lord Chief Justice have intervened?
Well, no, it's political if they maintain their membership, because they are showing that
are they allowed to go, if they were at all male schools, to a reunion of their school?
Well, you could say that they went to those schools as a result of decisions made by their parents.
What if they belong to a rugby team that meets twice a year for a rugby reunion?
It's been accepted that we have that the sexes are separated in sport like rugby, so we don't yet have mixed rugby teams.
So if they've been a member of a club for 40 years that has not allowed women in, suddenly that's different. I just don't see the logic of that.
I think actually, going back to the school's point, if they sent their own children to a male-only or a girls-only school, I think that would be questionable. But I don't think it's as questionable as an institution like the Garrick Club.
So if the Lord Chief Justice belongs to the Women's Institute, should she resign?
Probably.
OK. It's quite an extreme view that Michael's giving us.
Well, of course it is. It's totally nonsense. And he knows it's totally nonsense.
He knows it, yeah.
Of course.
He doesn't know it's nonsense.
Look, at the end of the day,
Women's Institute bit,
need our own spaces, and women need their own spaces. Don't forget, there are 9 female-only clubs in London. Is there a clamouring to go and join from men? Of course there isn't.
I suppose the argument is that men go in there and network and stitch things up.
No.
But they don't, do they?
No, they don't. Oh, I wish we could.
No.
Oh,
no.
It'd be so good, wouldn't it, if we could? But this is the whole thing. Certain women are saying, oh, we're missing out in networking. If you were eligible for the Garrick and you were a networker, you wouldn't get in. If you were trying to do career opportunities, you wouldn't get in. They just misunderstand the whole thing.
People do try to network in these clubs. I've seen it happen, and they are very much looked askance at. They are not the sort of people who want to...
Come off it. You mean, if you network subtly, that's allowed?
No. It just isn't what these clubs are about. And most clubs specifically prohibit business papers, the discussion of business.
Garrick, particularly.
The Garrick,
yes.
But other of the clubs of this kind.
But networking involves getting to know people. You may not discuss business at all on the premises or bring out your papers. But the very fact that you get to know each other,
Michael,
that can prove useful in business.
By the time you've joined the
on.
Garrick, you don't need to network.
Now,
yes,
if you take one of these judges, for instance, supposing one of these judges had to sit in court on a case involving sexual discrimination or alleged sexual discrimination, a civil case or maybe a criminal case, the fact that they had belonged to the Garrick Club would undermine their authority and independence as a judge.
No, it wouldn't. I tell you, as a matter of law, and it'll cost you 100 guineas now. And that is that same-sex clubs, including women's same-sex clubs, are excluded from the Equalities Act.
Well, they shouldn't be.
Well, no,
They
but
are.
that's the
They should be.
law.
We're not here judging. Yes, but let's
That's
get
the law.
because if you were the party in in that case, a woman.
But let's get back to this Lord Chief Justice.
You would feel aggrieved. Whether it was the law or
this
or
new
not.
lady who's become Lord Chief Justice intervening, because that seems to me a political intervention. And she should be above politics. And saying she wants diversity and inclusion is a political statement. That is a political slogan of the left.
Well, occasionally judges do make political judgments like that.
But that's very dangerous because it undermines the perceived independence of the judiciary. I now think the Lord Chief Justice is an old lefty.
If a club
that's
can,
wrong.
If a club can find itself to left,
Well, defend her. She said
she's in favour of diversity, inclusion, and left-wing buzzwords.
No, they're not. That is the if you like, the mission statement. God, it's an awful.
Well, there you go.
That's... No. But of course, she's in favour of those things. She's not saying judges.
And she's looking seriously at the Garrick Club membership. I mean, her statement was quite hostile to Garrick, according to the Telegraph report.
I think you're being too sensitive.
The Lord Chief Justice is making it clear that members of the judiciary should be seen to be independent.
Well, they are.
It's not just be independent, but they should be seen to be independent.
Anti-male clubs, she doesn't seem to be independent. She seems to have a left-wing axe to grind.
No, it's not a left-wing axe. There are
Excuse me, what about the All-Women's Bar Association?
Excellent. What about it? Now, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, with his clean air scheme, has a new vigilante of whom he ought to be cautious. Well, dunna, Batman, as you probably realise, new tactics are being employed in North Cheam, where the anti-ULEZ protesters are assumed to have once again taken matters into their own hands and have placed bat boxes on lampposts to prevent ULEZ cameras being installed. Now, bats and their roosts are legally protected in Britain, and it can be an offence to disturb or destroy any places used by the animals for feeding or resting, or to obstruct access to a roost, even if it's not being used. Thus, this means that if it's a bat box versus a ULEZ camera, the bats have it. Well, now back to my sometimes batty panel.
Oh, it's rubbish.
Jerry.
It's rubbish, because there are no bats. If there were bats...
No, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether they're using them or not. It's if they may use them. The law on bats
they may. Oh, they may use them.
They may use them.
Oh, yeah. I think there are too many bats in the belfry in this.
All right, bats in the belfry?
Well, if what you say is true, Jacob, and I doubt it, I mean, surely there has to be a bat before you apply this law. But if it is batty, this law, and it's probably passed by one of your governments that you're a supporter of.
It's EU regulation that we've still got. It comes from the Habitats Directive, I think.
Well,
not from business.
In any case, protesters are going to use this all over the place, aren't they?
Well, I mean, seriously, I think it's quite a good thing, because these ridiculous regulations are stopping developments up and down the country. There is a complete racket of bat experts going out to look for bats to charge developers and even people with relatively small planning applications to show there are or there aren't bats, and having to put up bat boxes if their roost is moved. And perhaps this will make people realise this racket should stop.
Let me tell you about newts, and I don't mean think-nottle newts.
No.
The fact of the matter is, Epping Town Hall, years and years and years ago, had to be moved because of a crested newt. Crested newts are far more dangerous than bats to planning permission. So I think it's a crested newt situation, perhaps.
But the bats getting in the way of a lefty scheme of the Mayor of London may make the lefties who are so avid for the Habitats Directive change their mind.
Well, I'm more worried about the right-wing people who destroy, who commit criminal damage against...
Oh, yeah, but I'm against criminal damage.
See, this will be taken up by the left and use it for their protests.
Oh, yeah, indeed.
And, where will it end? I can't think of any good examples off the top. I should have thought about this.
Well, it'll stop all the motorways being widened and everything of this kind.
Well, it would have stopped HS2 if the government hadn't done so. The whole thing is...
I think the whole thing about bats has become a racket. If we're to use sporting... Thank you to my panel. Coming up next, the moment you've all been waiting for. I will be getting into a farmer's tractor and debating the benefits of cheap food imports for British consumers.
Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m. It's the border force interrogation that many think shames Britain.
We're the bosses, not you, all right?
Tonight, I speak to the Israeli brothers and October 7th survivors who were on the receiving end.
Someone in an official job treat me like this. I don't feel safe in this country.
Plus, banned Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir have been running rife in Stoke-on-Trent. The city's MPs, Jonathan Gullis and Jack Brereton, are live in the studio to say enough is enough. I will have another migrant crisis exclusive, and you will get the first look at tomorrow's newspaper front pages. Don't miss Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m. Be there.
Tubes & Co. Weekdays from 6 p.m.
You think this country needs new gas power stations. Apparently, this will all be about trying to get some form of energy security. Rishi Sunak has upset people today with this suggestion, people saying that actually this would do more damage to climate change than it would do good. Where are you on it, Richard?
I'll tell you exactly where we need a lot more gas power stations and nuclear power stations, because quite often the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Last week, we imported 16% of all our electricity because we haven't got enough capacity in the UK, and we're now totally over-reliant on renewables.
The part of the problem is the lack of storage capacity, which the government has finally got round to addressing. I think this as backup is actually quite a sensible idea. But they are not doing anything, as far as I can tell. At the moment, it will be retrofitted to have storage capability, which seems to be utterly bonkers. I mean, anyone who's got solar panels, you know very well you're storing up energy. So it's about storage as much as production. They could have gone, 20 years ago, we could have had nuclear power. We could have done more. We haven't looked far enough ahead in the future, and we are in grave danger of making the same mistake. I mean, the other side of this is, what is the difference going to be? Blackouts are, they're irritating and...
Irritating? It'd be disastrous. It would destroy our economy.
Well, they would be now, but, some of us remember 3-day weeks and things like that. And in fact, I grew up thinking that everybody had, at least a couple of days a week when they had to eat off a primus stove and things.
This is, again, I don't want to harp on, but this is one of the problems in the politics in our country, isn't it? So many politicians, they just think in election cycles. Absolutely. They just think, what can I do and say to get my own backside re-elected at the next general election? They're not always looking ahead at, actually, politics aside, what is genuinely the best thing for this country?
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
Well, welcome back. We've been discussing the Garrick and Bat boxes with a little help from Batman. Annie says on the Garrick, 100% agree with men-only and women-only clubs. So no issue with the Garrick Club. I don't want men at my WI either. I did once go and address the WI in East Harptree. It's absolutely delightful and the most delicious puddings. I had 3 or 4 of them. John says there are plenty of exclusive clubs based on gender, race and various likes and dislikes. What's wrong with that? Woke folk don't like it. And bat boxes, Bradley says batty but brilliant. Well, I think that's a very good line. But I think we do have to be serious about it. We need to ensure that people can get on with their ordinary life. And this is applying across the planning system, where there really is this racket of experts charging a fortune to cause delays for sometimes non-existent bats. But that's all until we move on to British farmers who held a protest in Westminster, a matter of yards away from where I'm sitting right now, with about 70 tractors trawling the streets around the Palace of Westminster. Farmers' main gripe is what they call declining food standards amidst a number of new post-Brexit trade deals, which they say has hurt their industry. But I believe this view is fundamentally misguided. The priority ought to be British consumers, and so cheap food imports can only be a good thing. As long as people know what they're buying and there's proper labelling, the UK spends less as a proportion of salaries on food than most other developed nations. This is beneficial, and our new trade deals continue to help consumers. The real threat to British farmers are the green regulations that attempt to turn agricultural land into wildlife, which ultimately makes British farms uncompetitive. Earlier today, I was joined by Douglas Turner, a British farmer who once again made the journey to Westminster to discuss this important matter.
How are you, Jacob?
Very
nice to see
you. So you've come up from Wiltshire?
I have, yes.
Good journey in your tractor?
Fantastic journey. It's farming weather.
You didn't come on the M4?
No, we're not allowed on the M4 on these. We would like
be.
to be, but no, something to do with the rules and regulations.
There are always
but
rules
if you're
and
just
regulations.
up oil, you can actually sit on there, but we can't go on there with the tractors.
Can't go on there with the tractor. Yes, indeed. No, it's one rule for them and one rule for everybody else.
Exactly.
So tell me about your campaign.
We want a fairer deal for British farmers. What's happening at the moment, the imports, and partially because of Brexit as well, that food stuff can come in from other countries and we're not making it. The government, unfortunately, are paying farmers to grow wildflowers and wood, trees. You can't eat that though, so we don't need to be doing that all the time. And this makes it a problem. We want a fairer playing field.
Well, you see, I agree with your request for a fairer playing field. I think farmers have been poorly treated, but I don't agree with you on imports. You see, what we're doing with our tariffs has been protecting Irish, French and Dutch farmers and not allowing people to buy things from our old friends such as Australia and New Zealand. And I think that's a mistake.
Yes.
But I strongly agree with you on fair labelling, because am I right in thinking that food can say made in England, made in Great Britain, made in the United Kingdom, and it's not?
It comes from another country, and because it's packaged here, it looks as though to the public that it actually is homegrown when it's not at all. And the problem is we don't homegrow things, and if I must go back to this woodland part, farmers are paid too much money to grow wood, to have trees put in there, and each time we take an acre of arable land out of production in this country, in the Amazon and places, they have to take down 2.5 acres.
And it seems to me there's a really bad environmental ideology that is hampering British farming, but as you rightly say, not actually helping the environment globally.
No, not at all. And also for us, we have so much legislation that comes out all the time from various government bodies, probably your good self as well, I don't know, and it hinders us. You know, we have the Prime Minister saying he's got our back. We have the other ministers saying that they've got our back as well in the farming. But the only reason they got our back is because they're pushing us out of farming and we won't be farming in this country anymore. We cannot import everything. We must be able to have our homegrown stuff because we farm it better. Nobody farms it better than us.
I noticed that farmers in my constituency in Somerset that can compete fairly do really well. They have done all the right things. They've invested, they have added value by completing the production chain, they've set up farm shops, but that regulation and reward for not farming is just a huge burden on the backs of farmers.
It's too much. To be paid to actually have trees in there and not to actually have food is a bad thing, because if we import too much and they have a bad harvest in those countries, what's going to happen? They won't have food to come to us and it's going to be very expensive for us as well.
And the other issue is environmental regulations. Again, in my own constituency, dairy farmers have been saying to me that the new regulations on slurry pits are requiring them to make enormous investments with not necessarily any financial support from the government, which is going to put our dairy industry out of business. And we have some of the best dairy land in the world.
Well, exactly. Well, further down in Cornwall, in the year 2000, they used to have 1,200 dairy farms. They've only got 400 now. They've lost 67% of it. So why is this happening?
Well, it seems to me it's regulation. This comes back to my starting point. I think that British farmers can be globally competitive. and I think you can compete on price and quality, and that people will buy British food and they will need British food. I wouldn't have tariffs and barriers against imports. I would insist on fair labelling, so you know where it's coming from, or you even know if it's been hormone treated. That should be a choice for consumers. It shouldn't be a choice for the state, but that you have your hands tied behind your back with regulation.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The problem we suffer most of the time is that you have the townies and the city dwellers making up the rules for the custodians of the countryside, and that's the farmer.
Douglas, thank you very much, and a safe journey back to your farm.
Thank you very much.
Go on in, Jacob. Let's go for a drive. Thank you. I've been looking forward to this. Well, isn't it wonderful to see those cows? I think they're the most beautiful animals and fundamentally Tory, solid and reliable. That's all from me. Up next, it's Patrick Christie's. Patrick, what's on your bill of fare this evening?
Yes, I've got an electric show for you tonight, Jacob. It's time to name and shame the immigration judges who are letting monsters walk free in Britain. How many asylum seekers have committed sexual crimes? We have a right to know, and I speak to the Israelis who were hounded by Border Force.
Oh, that's going to be extremely interesting. I'm glad you're having an electric show. Once we get to net zero, there'll be no electricity, even for our programmes. That's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this has been State of the Nation. And the weather in Somerset, well, I hear from my wife and children who are safely ensconced there, it is absolutely lovely, ideal for walking the dog, Daisy, who you've seen, and the sun will be shining beautifully as we prepare for our Easter celebrations.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there, time to look at the Met Office forecast for GB News. Rain and hill snow across northern parts of the UK during the next 24 hours. Showers moving in elsewhere, although interspersed by at least some brighter interludes. Low pressure still well and truly in charge. That low mainly sitting towards the southwest of the UK, and it is sending a band of rain north during the evening into Northern Ireland, where some wet weather could cause issues, rain warning in force, as well as central and northern England, parts of Wales, and then eventually that rain moves into Scotland, where it mixes with cold air to give some snow above 200 or 300 metres. The far north stays dry but chilly. And further south, some clear spells, although the next area of rain moves in by dawn to affect southwest England, Wales, Northern Ireland as well. Heavy downpours, gusty winds, and then that rain, well, it tends to turn to showers as it moves into central UK by the afternoon. Further showers arrive later from the southwest with gusty winds, hail and thunder. A lively afternoon, although with some pretty clouds in the sky. Now, in the far north, we're going to see wet and windy weather remain until Thursday morning, and then Thursday starts off bright across Scotland and Northern Ireland. Elsewhere, for England and Wales, a blustery start with further heavy rain to come, followed by showers, and those showers developing fairly widely as we go into the Easter weekend. I suspect Good Friday, Saturday and Easter Day. Mostly, we're going to see sunny spells and showers before more prolonged rain on Monday.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
It's the final week to see how you could win big. You could win an amazing £12,345 in tax-free cash that you could spend however you like. Plus, there's a further £500 of shopping vouchers to spend at your favourite store. We'll also give you a gadget package to use in your garden this spring. That includes a games console, a pizza oven and a portable smart speaker, so you can listen to GB News on the go. You have to hurry, as lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday. For another chance to win the vouchers, the treats and £12,345 in tax-free cash, text GB WIN to